hope you guys have been enjoying this series as much as I have. It's been really rewarding just to look at some of the people in the Old Testament and see the way that God has showed up in their lives in extraordinary ways. I kind of want to open up just with an idea for you, or even with a picture. So I have a picture of a sailboat that's going to be on the screen. And I don't know about you, but I've always kind of been a little fascinated with water. I mean, I love being at the lake. I love being around water. But I've just been always amazed at people that sail. I know nothing about boats. I know nothing about sailing. But I just kind of want to play a little bit of a game with you, if you will. So if you just kind of imagine that you decide to go sailing at some point. And so the problem is that you know absolutely nothing about sailing if you're like me. And so you go to the shore and you look around for some boats, maybe see someone that's selling their boat. So you decide to buy it. So then you go and you try to figure out more about what there is to know about sailboats. You carefully read all the instructions you can find online. Maybe you talk to a veteran sailor. And as you're talking to him, you realize there's a lot that goes into a sailboat. Maybe just to make sure you kind of just rent a sailboat, to make sure you actually know how to do it. And so you examine it closely to make certain that everything is exactly as it's supposed to be. Make sure all the ropes are good, make sure all the knots are tied correctly, make sure everything is good in working order. Then you finally take your boat out onto the lake or wherever you're sailing, and you follow all those instructions, and the moment you actually open up the sail, you realize that there's one component that's just missing, right? And you can know all there is to know about sailing, you know all there is to know about how to make a sailboat look exactly the way it's supposed to look, but if there's no wind, it's not going to go anywhere, right? Like, it doesn't matter how much you know, if there's no wind, it's not going to go anywhere. And so with that in mind, I think that's kind of already a metaphor for us to kind of jump into this message this morning, is that unless God is in it, we can know everything there is to know about our faith. We know everything there is to know about how to live a Christ-like life. But if God's not in it, it doesn't really mean much, honestly. That's just kind of the hard truth there. But the truth is, as much as we would love to just have all the right methods, know all the perfect things of how to be a Christian, how to be a disciple, again, God has to be in it. And so, again, as I've kind of just been reflecting on this series, I've been just amazed at how God has shown up. I think I've probably mentioned it almost every week at this point. I had a hard time growing up reading some of the Old Testament stories and seeing how God's supposed to be exactly the same in the Old Testament as he is in the New Testament. Because a lot of the things we read is this God of wrath, this God of just righteous anger against people, and he destroys people, and yet he's also walking alongside people. And so the premise of the series has been that these are not superheroes we're reading about. These people were not ordinary, or they were not extraordinary in any way. We've talked about King David. We've talked about all his brokenness and his sin and how he ran away from it, and yet he was also described as a man after God's own heart because he admitted his brokenness, he admitted his sins, and God redeemed him. We talked about Moses and how he was hesitant to follow God's calling on his life, and so he literally ran away, and yet God just called him exactly to go back to where he just ran from. Deborah, we talked about her. She was a judge who had a dynamic faith in God to give her guidance and wisdom, and allowed Israel to achieve this underdog victory. We talked about ShamWow. We talked about Barak. We talked about all these different people that the Bible talks about in the Old Testament. And last week, we talked about Elisha and how he was a farmer and how he just had this moment where he had ridiculous faith. He said, doesn't matter what's behind me, I'm going forward. I'm going to follow God now. And so this is probably going to kill some of you that I'm going out of chronological order, because so far I've been going through, but we're actually going to take a step back, and we're actually going to look at Elijah, Elisha's predecessor. And so if any of those stories have resonated with you so far, I'm glad, and I hope that you will continue to allow God to speak to you, but I got to be honest with you, this message this morning is probably the most impactful for me personally. Honestly, it really is. Because if you're like me, you probably found yourself thinking, even though these people weren't superheroes or anything, they weren't superheroes, they weren't extraordinary, they still had bold, dynamic faith. They had faith that could move them forward in life. But if you're like me, I see all these stories and I think, this is not me. Like, I'm not necessarily the guy that's always going to go headfirst into whatever God's calling me to do. I'm not always that person. I don't have that dynamic, ridiculous faith that we've talked about. And so if that's you, this is also going to be a message that I think will really bless you this morning. And so with that in mind, I kind of want to give you guys a little bit of pre-context, okay? Just looking at Elijah's life. And so Elijah was, again, Elisha's predecessor as the prophet over Israel. Now Elijah and Moses, they were arguably the two most famous people in the entire Old Testament. They did miraculous things through God. I mean, again, Moses with the Exodus and leading God's people out of Egypt. And for Elijah, he is this very wise, very powerful leader for God. And yet, we know nothing about him when he first is mentioned. We know nothing about his story, we know nothing about his family, what his previous occupation was. We know nothing, nada, zilch. But Elijah, we do know, was that he was a prophet during a very, very scary time in Israel's past. Israel has just been coming out of 19 kings consecutively that were all described as being wicked. And so in verse 1630, of 1 Kings chapter 16:30, it says that Ahab is the king of that time. Ahab did more evil in the eyes of the Lord than any of those before him. So put it in our context. You can just kind of walk with me through this. If you can just imagine, we've had 19 of the worst presidents ever. And not only is their term not limited to 4 years, but it's just however long they are alive or someone decides to push them out of office. I mean, that's the kind of atmosphere that Israel is in. And so for Elijah to come into this place, into this role as a prophet over Israel, it was a scary, scary time. And so again, then you insert Ahab, who's the most awful person you could possibly imagine to be your king. He also decides to marry this wonderful lady that we describe as Jezebel. Now, for those of you that may not be as familiar with the word Jezebel, it's not necessarily a name you probably want to name your daughter. She's arguably one of the most wicked people in the world. And she's not a good lady. She's not good at all. She corrupted him even further, inviting these pagan gods, inviting these idols for Ahab to worship. The biggest one, of course, is known as Baal. He was this god over the harvest. He was a god of fertility. He was a god of all things that would grow. And so Ahab and Jezebel are doing their thing. They're worshiping these pagan gods, worshiping idols. And Elijah comes around, and he has a message he's supposed to deliver to Ahab. And so finally, we pick up with him in chapter 17, verse 1. It'll be on the screen. It says, Now Elijah, the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead, said to Ahab, again, say that 5 times fast. It kind of sounds like a rap or something. As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years except at my word. Now, just already stop there. That is a big deal for Elijah to show up at Ahab's palace, essentially, tell him exactly the God that you've been worshiping now for so long with your wife, your wicked wife, whatever you want to call her, all the things that God's supposed to do for you, I'm telling you that's not going to happen. All that rain, all the growth that you expect to happen because you're worshiping Baal, not going to happen. And so Elijah is being very confrontational. He has his message. He's faithful to go. He's already being obedient to God in his message that he was supposed to relay to Ahab. And yet, Elijah's faith is not being formed in a way that we're going to see. It's not finished. Again, he was obedient, but as far as what he's supposed to do and God's not giving him clear direction, we're going to see later on through this message about how God shapes and molds Elijah. And so, verse 2, God tells him the most obvious thing. He says, get out of there, bro. Like, you just told this guy nothing good is going to happen, and so you need to leave. He says, the word of the Lord came to Elijah, leave here, turn eastward and hide at Kerith Ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there. Now I just want to pause there. A couple things I want to point out. First of all, ravens don't normally supply food. Hope we all know that this morning. I wish that ravens could somehow transport our food. I don't know, it would be nice to have like a raven specifically for Burger King or something right here. But that's not how it works nowadays. And so that is pretty amazing, first off, that Elijah trusts God for that. But the thing I really want to point out, though, is Kerith Ravine. Now, that may not sound like any sort of special word to us, but Kerith literally translates to cut out or cut down. And so essentially, God's saying, look, you've just relayed my message. You're being a very good prophet so far. But all this comfort, all this safeness you've been feeling, I'm going to isolate you. I'm going to send you to a place where you're literally going to feel cut off or cut out, cut down from where you're at. And so if we're keeping Elijah's story so far kind of at a bird's eye view, God is shaping Elijah through isolation. So he sends him out into this desert, this place where nothing is growing because it hasn't rained in so long. There's not really a plentiful amount of food or water. And yet Elijah is just supposed to stay there until God gives him another message. And so the first point, for those of you that take notes, I want to point out is that God is always seeking to form us for our good. God always seeks to form us for our good. And so I say that, and some of you may feel like you're in a great spot with God. You know, you may feel like you've done all the right things, and then bam, all of a sudden, God's abandoned you. Life doesn't look as positive as it used to look. You know, maybe you've heard that you're not going to have many resources, or maybe you're in a falling out with your friends or a spouse. You may be in a falling out to where you feel like there's no hope. And yet the message is still the same, that God sends Elijah into us today, is that if we trust him, we'll find him. And we'll find that he is still taking care of us, even when we feel cut off and cut down. Now, things get a little bit more interesting for Elijah, okay? So he goes out in the desert, he's spending time there, he's being fed by the ravens, which just sounds awesome. Like, I wish ravens would come feed me again. But he goes from that place, and the Lord speaks to him once again in verse 8. He says, "Go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." Now, two more things I want to point out. Zarephath is not a place that Elijah would have wanted to go to at all. So remember Jezebel, that awful, wicked lady that I just talked about? Guess where her hometown was? It was Zarephath. And so, for Elijah to go to this place is like in the hub center. It's basically the main capital city of this empire that is dedicated to worshiping Baal, to worshiping all these crazy idols. And obviously, if something as monstrous as Jezebel could come out of Zarephath, it's not exactly a place that Elijah was exactly giddy to go to. And so, he's faithful and obedient, though, and he goes, and he finds that widow. And as he's going there, he finds her and then asks for a drink and maybe even some bread. Now, this lady was not exactly in the best place. She wasn't exactly in a place where she felt like she could really host or give anything to Elijah. And we see some of kind of her reluctance to listen to him in verse 12. She says, "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." Like, just want to pause. If that's where you're at in life, you're probably not in a place to be hosting this prophet that just shows up, right? Like, you're not exactly in a place where you feel like you can really do anything for this guy. And yet, he's asking you for some water, which would probably be pretty hard to come by in those days, but especially the bread. Like, she only has just enough for her and her son. If that doesn't speak to you, like, that's amazing. It speaks to me because, again, I can feel so often in life that I don't have anything left. And yet, God calls me to give every ounce of who I am to something. We can all relate to that. And so I can feel the pain and the amazement this lady has in her words. Of all the things Elijah could have asked for, he had to ask her for some bread. I don't think he was being a jerk here. I just think he was being exactly what God called him to do. And so you could argue she was in such a rough spot because of the drought they're experiencing in the land. If you think about it that way too. I mean, for Elijah to approach this lady, he probably had to feel some guilt. He probably had to feel a little bit reluctant himself. Not to mention, again, that she was probably not a believer in God. She wasn't in a position to be giving him anything. And yet, that's exactly what God called him to do. And so, as we're kind of seeing, God is revealing himself to Elijah, certainly, but also to this widow. And with that in mind, we're going to continue on reading verse 13. And so Elijah said to her, "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first, make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land." Now again, I don't think Elijah's being a greedy jerk. I think he's simply being faithful to what God told him to do. God is also using this as an opportunity to make himself known in the widow's life and in Elijah's life. So, the woman listens to Elijah. She goes, she makes the bread, she uses all the oil up for Elijah, and then for her meal to share with her son. And yet, something miraculous happens. You can kind of read through the chapter. I won't read it for you right now. But she goes and she checks it the next day, and lo and behold, there's still flour, there's still oil. Everything that Elijah just promised happened. And so you got to imagine being in her shoes. She's not a believer in God, and yet this supposed prophet, this man of God, came to her, asking her for the last thing she wanted to give. And yet God blessed her because of it. So you got to imagine she's on top of the world, right? She's in a place where she feels like she could probably believe in God at this point. But it doesn't stay that way, right? Life does not just stay up just because we feel up, right? Sometimes life takes a curve that we are not prepared for. And so in verse 17, after some time, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. Like, I'm so amazed if you can kind of put yourself in the widow's shoes. They've just been dealing with starvation. They're dealing with lack of resources. Arguably, in their culture, she probably didn't have any money. Whatever money was coming was probably just from donations from people who felt bad for her. But then for her son to deal with struggling with starvation and then all of a sudden just to become ill, just become sick, and then to die? How is God in that, right? That's the kind of questions I would imagine I'd be asking her in her shoes. And so I want to pause for a moment, just allow us to dwell on a hard truth. And that's simply that obeying God does not mean we will avoid pain and loss. I know that's hard. We've all faced similar moments, though. We've all gotten that phone call that says, sorry, they didn't make it. We've all heard results from the doctor we didn't want to hear. And even though reality may not have set in yet, we know that things are going to be different for the rest of our life. We've all been in moments where we are totally changed in the trajectory of our life because of something that just happened. Not because of anything we did, not because of anything someone else did, just because that's life sometimes. And I don't think that that's because God gets a kick out of our pain and suffering. That's not who God is. But the truth is, and this is our second point, that God wants our heart more than he wants our happiness. Another way to say it maybe would be that God wants our heart more than he wants our contentment. You know? Maybe God wants our heart more than he wants our comfort. I think that was true in their life. See, in this moment, the widow faces a question, similar to what the question that we face today. And that's simply, will I cling to God's character? Can I cling to God's character? Is he worth trusting? And I don't think it was wrong for her to question. I don't think it was wrong at all. I don't think it was a sin. And so in verse 18, the widow cries out, and what I can only imagine were tears. She asks, what do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and to kill my son? Again, this is not a sin for her to question God's motives. It's not a sin for her to question Elijah's motives either. She's testing God's character, and that is a biblical thing to do. It's okay when we ask questions like that. And so, again, put yourself kind of now in Elijah's shoes again. All these things that have happened with the drought, the lack of resources this woman has been experiencing with her son, everything that's happened, is it because of him? Oh, I think my mic just died, sorry. Use the green one. Everything that just happened, has this all happened because of something that I did? Is God really good? And so in verse 20, Elijah cries out in a similar way. He says, Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die? And I want to point out there, in Elijah's questioning here, in his cry out, this is almost like a, are you kidding me, God? Like, of all the things that could possibly happen, this is what's happening. Like, why in the world have you sent me to this woman just for her to experience more pain and more loss? But in the middle of his questioning, at the very start actually, he says, Lord my God, and that would translate to living God or existing one. Basically, he's calling out all these attributes about who God is. He's saying, you're worthy, you are powerful, you are magnificent, all these things that you could possibly imagine for God to be. That's what he's saying here. He says, Lord, even though you're worthy, Lord, even though you are the creator, all these things about you, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die? See, it's a broken cry of worship. It's not worship that always sounds beautiful. It doesn't sound like a magnificent chorus. It's a teary-eyed, ugly worship, right? But it's genuine, it's truth, it's real, it's raw. All these things. So Elijah's clinging on to God's character. He's clinging to who God is, knowing God's character. Elijah knows that this is not supposed to be, this is not the way it's supposed to be. And so Elijah does something a little bit different here. Continuing on, he stretches himself over the boy. He cries out to the Lord, Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him. And this next verse is huge. It says, the Lord heard Elijah's cry. that enough in itself should give us some encouragement. Amen? The fact that he cries out, and yet this God of the universe, the God who's so immense, so holy, so powerful, all these things that we can say, also is low enough and close enough to listen and to hear him. And so the boy's life is returned to him and he lives. So Elijah comes down from the room where he's staying. He carries him down to his mother and tells her, "Look, your son is alive." And then she replies, "Now I know that you truly are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." Man, what an amazing story, right? Of all the things that could have happened in Elijah's life up until this point, this is what happens. He experiences this loss, he experiences his own isolation, and then to go into a place where no one wants to go, and to experience this incredible miracle with God. But I want to suggest something. I don't think the real miracle here is really that the son lives, or that the oil and the water and the flour never runs out. I think the real miracle here is how God draws this widow's heart to himself. I think the real miracle is that Elijah discovers more about God's character. Because again, Elijah was probably a very wise man on his own. But because he found this ability to depend on God, to call upon him, and to know that God would listen, that God would respond, that's a miracle in and of itself. And so the miracle here that we all have to experience and ask ourselves is, are we really depending on God? I mean, it's a fair question, are we? See, I think more and more God's trying to show us who he is. And it doesn't become any easier in our world, we know that. But we all have a choice again. We can either decide if we're going to cling on to God's character, or if we're going to avoid it, if we're going to run the other direction. And I'm thankful that we have the example of people that had some real questions, some real concerns about life. And because of their vulnerability with God, God spoke to them. And that's true for us today as well. So just a couple applications, if you will. If you bear with me just for a moment. If we look at our life and we see all these seasons that we go through, all these pain, all these suffering, all the things that we can experience, and you don't feel like you're close to God, first off, it's okay. Like, that should be like a big sigh of relief for you. Like, everyone, if you will, just kind of do that with me. Just breathe in and breathe. That should be a sigh of relief, because God is with us in those moments. He's with us when we feel most isolated, when we feel most alone. That should preach. So, again, if you're in those spots, it's okay to question. It's okay to question if God's there. Secondly, if you know that God's calling you to do something, and it may not necessarily be the thing you want to do, it's okay to be faithful even in those moments. Kind of put yourself in Elijah's shoes again, just with this whole scenario of the widow. She was not a believer. He had no reason to suspect that she would even respond to him, much less do anything for him. And we think about that in our context. There are people that don't know Christ. There are people that don't know Jesus. We know that. But I think so often in church we try to isolate ourselves from those people because we don't want to be affected, right? We don't want to be impacted. We don't want to be corrupted by anything that they would do. But we look all throughout Scripture, especially in Elijah's story. That's not how God worked. God worked through people that should not have been working for him. And when we do that, when we're faithful to expose ourselves to people like that, to people that may not even believe, I think it can transform our faith too. Because again, it did bring this woman closer to God, certainly. You know, she's praising God by the end of this chapter. But it also brings us closer to God as well. It shows his character, that in every single person there is infinite worth, infinite value. And that would not have happened if Elijah would have resignated himself, essentially, to just staying on his holy horse, you know, his high horse. So it's a calling for each of us just to look in our daily lives. Again, you go to the grocery store, you get annoyed waiting in line. I do too. It's okay. But that's also an opportunity to see God's character, see God's image in someone that we may not even initially think about. We think about our spouse and how much sometimes they can aggravate us. Sometimes they can be just almost all sorts of stress and whatnot. It's okay. In those moments where we may not initially feel God's character emanating from them, because I'm sure it's certainly not the same way either when they look at me, when my wife looks at me. Even in those moments, you can still look to God's character and see, you know what? God's working on their behalf. He's working on my behalf. And so the question really is simply, when you're looking at your life, you may feel isolated, you may feel cut off or cut down. Are we leaning on God's word? Are we depending on who God is? Do we know his character? Do we cling on to it? I think we can. I think we're people that can cling on to him. Amen? So I'm going to pray for us, and you would just bow your heads with me. Father God, we're amazed at you, Lord. We've never done anything that was worthy of you, and yet you've given us all your love. Lord, we see you in every sunrise. We see you in every tear we've ever cried. And God, we know that you are with us. We may not always feel it, but we know it. Lord, I thank you for everyone in this room. I thank you for the testimonies that we all represent here. God, we have all come from brokenness. We've all come from sin. We've all come from questioning and doubt. And yet you met us there because you didn't want that to be the end of our stories. Lord, like this widow in this story, we had no reason to believe. We had no reason to think that you would be this almighty provider. And yet, you did. You provided. You showed up. So Lord, just as an act of worship, we commit ourselves to show up as well. We want to show up when you are there. Lord, when you are near, we want to be responding to you immediately. We want to be open to your messages. We want to be open to your prompting. So Lord, my prayer is simply that you would make me more open, more sensitive to your promptings. Lord, that we as a church, we as a body of believers would be more sensitive to your promptings, more open to where you would guide us. Lord, we love you today. We thank you for this wonderful service. Lord, we thank you for your word. We thank you that it is a weapon and it is an instrument that can dissect everything we've ever been afraid to let go of. So Lord, our cry is simply that you would just take our doubt, take all of our questions, and use them to mold us, to form us. God, I thank you again for this time. I thank you for these beautiful people and the honor it is to be your messenger this morning. Lord, we love you. We thank you again for this time, and we ask you to be with us until we come together again. We pray this all in your holy and precious and powerful name. Amen.